Okay, let's dive in. Today we're looking at a really fascinating historical account. It's from the book of Ezra, chapter 4 specifically.
Right. And we've got some sources here, research and commentary, that explore this ancient story.
Yeah, and they draw some really thought-provoking parallels between what happened back then and challenges faced in, as one source puts it, God's work today.
Absolutely. So just to set the scene, the people of Judah and Benjamin, they're back in Jerusalem after exile.
And they have a job to do, right? Given by King Cyrus of Persia.
Exactly. Rebuild the temple. Sounds straightforward, maybe even divinely blessed, you'd think?
But Ezra 4 shows it was. Well, not so simple.
Not at all. Opposition pops up almost right away.
So our material digs into that first encounter, Ezra 4, verses 1 and 2. Who shows up first? What's their angle?
Well, the people who hear about the building, they're identified as the enemies of Judah and Benjamin, specifically Samaritans, a mixed group living there.
Okay. And their first move, not direct opposition.
No, not initially. It was more subtle. They approached the leaders, Zerubbabel and Jeshua.
And they offer to help. Is that it? Saying something like, let us build with you. We seek your God, too.
That's exactly it. They claimed they'd been sacrificing to him since the time of Esarhaddon, king of Ashur, trying to sound like they're on the same page.
Okay, but the sources we have interpret this differently.
They do. They frame it as a tactic. Infiltration is the word used.
Exfiltration.
Yeah, the idea being it wasn't a genuine offer. It's seen as an attempt by the opposition. One source even connects it to, sort of, a strategy of the devil to get his people involved.
To stop the work from the inside, maybe? Or corrupt it?
Precisely. Sabotage while looking like an ally. Classic move, as you said.
So how did Zerubbabel and Jeshua handle that? Did they see through it?
Ezra 4.3 shows a really clear response. They rejected it, flat out.
What did they say?
Basically, you have nothing in common with us for building a house for our God. We'll do it ourselves, just like King Cyrus ordered, setting a firm boundary.
How did they know it wasn't sincere, though? Does the material give any insight there?
Well, one source offers an interesting perspective. It suggests the leaders knew the Samaritans weren't truly serving God as commanded because they weren't sacrificing in Jerusalem.
Ah, the designated place.
Right, and this source then draws a parallel for today, saying this is kind of a model for discernment in ministry, testing the spirit, checking claims against God's word, referencing ideas like in 1 John 4.
Okay, interesting. So tactic 1, infiltration, is blocked. What happens next? They don't just give up, I assume.
No, definitely not. When the offer to join was refused, the opposition changed its approach. Ezra 4.4 and 5 describe how the locals started to discourage the builders.
Discourage them? How?
They're actively trying to make them afraid, dishearten them so they'd stop building. This is what our material calls intimidation.
Right, so shifting from sneaky to more direct pressure, psychological stuff.
Exactly. And it wasn't just words. The text also mentions they hired counselors against them to frustrate their purpose.
Hired counselors? Like lobbyists or officials?
Yeah, bribing officials, basically.
Yeah.
Using corruption to undermine the whole plan, slow it down.
And this wasn't just a quick thing.
No, this went on for a while, through the rest of Cyrus's reign and even into the reign of King Darius. It was sustained pressure.
And the material suggests this pattern, intimidation, external pressure, that still happens.
It does. It draws a parallel, saying this kind of thing often happens when people are genuinely trying to follow God's will. You face pushback.
Okay, so infiltration fails, they move to intimidation and corruption, slowing things down. But there's a third stage, right? An escalation.
Yes, the third tactic really ramps it up. It moved into legislation.
Legislation, using the government.
Exactly. Ezra 4, verses 6 and 7 talk about how under later kings, Xerxes and Artaxerxes, that's Akashverosh and Artamachshasta, in the text, the enemies took their case to the top.
They sent letters, formal complaints.
Formal accusations, yes. Sent letters directly to the king, leveraging state power against the builders.
And wasn't there something about the language of one letter? Our notes mention that.
Yes. Good point. The source highlights the letter to Artaxerxes was written in Aramaic.
Which was common there, but maybe not the language of the Persian court itself.
Right. And the interpretation offered is that this might have been a subtle power play, like signaling to the king, look, things are happening in our own language out here. Maybe you're losing control.
That's insightful. A way to make the king uneasy. Who actually sent this letter? Was it just a few people?
No, it was a coalition. Ezra 4.810 lists them high officials like Rachel the governor, Shimshai the secretary, their colleagues, judges, various groups settled in Samaria and beyond the Euphrates. A united front against the rebuilding.
Okay, and how did this letter start? straight to the accusations.
Interestingly, no. Our source material points out it began with flattery,
Huh?
praising the king, emphasizing their loyalty.
Softening him up first.
Exactly. One source calls it a common tool. Used to manipulate people in power. Flattery is a weapon.
So after the flattery, what were the main charges against the Judeans?
Ezra 4.1112 gets to the core. They tell the king the Judeans are rebuilding Jerusalem, calling it a rebellious and wicked city.
Rebellious and wicked, that's strong language. And the analysis in our material calls this half-truths, right?
Yes, precisely. Half-truths.
Because they were rebuilding, but what crucial detail did they leave out?
They conveniently forgot to mention that the whole project was authorized by the previous king, Cyrus.
Right. That changes the whole picture.
It does. And the material uses this to comment on relying on governments. They change, policies shift. One king says yes, the next might say no.
So trust shouldn't be in government promises, ultimately.
That's the point the source makes. Trust has to be in God.
Okay, what else was in the letter, beyond the rebellious city claim?
Well, then they hit him where it hurts the treasury. Ezra 4.1316. They argued if the city and walls are rebuilt, the Judeans will stop paying taxes, tribute, tolls.
The financial angle, loss of royal revenue.
Exactly. They frame it like they're being loyal watchdogs, saying it's not right for us to see the king dishonored or losing money.
So protect the king's finances.
Right. And they urge him, search the archives. You'll see Jerusalem has always been rebellious. That's why it was destroyed before.
Using past history, maybe selectively, to paint a picture?
Mm-hmm. And our material really flags this focus on money, suggesting that ultimately financial concerns were used to sway the government.
And it draws a parallel to today.
Yeah, saying that even now legislation isn't always about truth or justice. Sometimes it's about the bottom line. Financial interest driving policy.
A bit cynical, maybe, but often true. How did they wrap up this letter, the final warning?
The final punch in Ezra 4.1c was blunt. If Jerusalem gets rebuilt, king, you'll lose control of everything west of the Euphrates River, a direct threat to his power and territory.
Wow, so quite a letter. Flattery, half-truths, financial fears, historical warnings, and a threat to his kingdom. How did King Artaxerxes respond?
Well, it worked. Ezra 4.1722 shows he received the letter and did exactly what they asked. He ordered a search of the archives.
And did the archives back up the claims about Jerusalem being rebellious?
Partially, yes. The search confirmed Jerusalem did have a history of powerful kings and, revolt. It had ruled the region.
And this worried the king.
The source material suggests it did. It made him afraid.
But you mentioned earlier this might have been based on incomplete information.
Right. The material calls it a partial search. It found the history of rebellion, but it seems they didn't find, or maybe didn't look for, King Cyrus's recent decree that had specifically authorized the rebuilding.
So the context was missing, a critical piece of the puzzle.
Exactly. Based on that incomplete picture, the king made his decision.
Which was?
He ordered the work to stop, immediately. He told Regem and Shimshai to go enforce it, stop the builders, warning them not to let the harm increase.
Using the force of the state to halt the project.
Yes. And our sources connect this directly to situations today, where governments might use legislation to try and restrain religious work or other activities they oppose.
So what happened on the ground in Jerusalem when that decree arrived?
Ezra 4.2324 is pretty stark. As soon as the letter was read, Rechem, Shimshai, and their crew rushed to Jerusalem.
And they stopped the work.
Yes. By force of arms, the text says, they physically stopped them.
Wow. So the work just ceased.
It did. The work on the temple stopped completely and stayed stopped until the second year of the next king, King Darius.
So the opposition, using legislation and force, actually won, at least for a time.
It certainly looked like it. The material calls it a temporary victory for the enemy. They succeeded in halting the work through government power and force.
Temporary victory. That phrase seems key here.
It is. Because even though they managed to stop things, the source material strongly emphasizes this wasn't the end of the story.
Right. The perspective is that these kinds of setbacks, whether ancient or modern legislative actions that seem to block things, they're ultimately temporary.
Exactly. That's the core message hammered home. These apparent wins for the opposition, they don't last. Because, as the source concludes, God is in control.
So the ultimate trust shouldn't be in human systems, laws, or promises, but elsewhere.
Precisely. In God.
Okay, so let's just quickly recap this pattern we've traced through Ezra 4 via these sources. It starts with deceptive infiltration.
Trying to get inside.
When that fails, it moves to intimidation, fear, discouragement, corruption.
Making it hard, frustrating the process.
And finally, escalating to legislation, using the power of the state, often with half-truths and financial arguments, to try and shut it down completely.
That's the sequence laid out: infiltration, intimidation, legislation.
And the constant refrain from the sources is that these same patterns can be seen in challenges faced today, particularly in what's termed God's work.
Yes, but always with that underlying message: God's in control, and these victories against his purposes are only temporary.
Now, beyond this specific analysis of Ezra 4, the source material we looked at also briefly mentions some related resources, things like info on how to be saved.
Right, and some background on how EFM began. That's Enduring Freedom Ministries.
And it also mentioned a book, didn't it? Misfits for Jesus, True Accounts of People Experiencing Jesus.
Yeah, suggesting these themes connect to wider faith issues, ministry histories, and personal stories.
Okay. So, drawing this all together, here's a thought for you, our listener, to take away and maybe chew on.
Mm-hmm.
How does understanding these ancient patterns of opposition, this infiltration, intimidation, legislation sequence from way back in Ezra's time, how might that change the way you view challenges you face today? Especially when you're trying to do something you feel is right or important, whether it's faith-related or any big project you're committed to. Does seeing this pattern make a difference?